going to hand you over to Mark in one moment. I'm just going to introduce him. Mark is if you don't know him already, he's an internationally acclaimed authority on both digital capture and post-production workflows. He's a photographer, educator, author, Sony Alpha Ambassador, and an Adobe Photoshop Ambassador. That's pretty impressive. He was also my teacher at RMIT. And he literally wrote the book on Photoshop. In fact, he's published over 30 books on the subject of photography and digital imaging that have been translated into more than 7 languages, including Chinese and Russian, and they've widely been adopted as the core curriculum in courses all over the world. So we're pretty lucky to have Mark here, and I want to thank Sony for bringing Mark here to share his composition and lighting tips. I'm sure we have a lot to learn, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Carly.
Thank you.
Well, it's great to see you all hung back till 5 o'clock, and hopefully you're going to take away a few things from today's seminar on portraiture. You can see I'm a local. This is a shot from near I live. This is Port Melbourne, looking back towards Melbourne CBD. And this is no better time to take a picture of this than in winter. The sun will rise directly over the CBD there. Okay, so if you're wanting to catch up with me after this seminar, I will go down to the camera stand, and I'll be standing by the Sony area, obviously. And but if you're wanting to catch up with me online, then I have this website, and this is markayler.com. And I've actually stopped writing books. I actually got to 30 and then stopped, but I haven't stopped writing per se. All of my educational outpourings go to this site. So you can download ebooks and Photoshop actions, Lightroom presets. You can get links to my hundreds of movies that I have on YouTube, and it's all free. There's no charge for downloading any of this sort of stuff. And if you're also trying to work out where I am and what I'll be talking about, I've also got a thing here called Talks. So I'm around Australia, so if you've got friends interstate who are interested in when they can catch up with me, then I should be interstate sometime this year. Okay, so if you are a Sony user, it doesn't matter if you're not, but if you are a Sony user, there is this Sony Alpha Australia Facebook group, and this is basically where people can ask questions, and I will spend some time each day making sure that Alpha users have their questions to their answers so they can get the best out of their camera systems. Okay, so we're looking at portraiture, composition and lighting. My commercial background is editorial. So not studio. I have worked in studios, but my passion is for being out, looking for stories, narrative, and basically shooting portraits, sometimes after meeting people for only a few seconds. For me, what I classify as a portrait and not a street shot is where we actually engage, even if it's just for a few seconds, with the subject of our photograph. So I'm not taking their photograph, they're pretty much giving me their image, and I'm hopefully trying to get them relaxed, not necessarily posing, but just going about their everyday life. Okay, so we'll start by saying light is our medium. Because I'm acutely aware of the light that is falling on somebody's face, and I will actually move somebody that I meet. I'll ask them to turn slightly, or could we just take 2 steps back if I think I can modify the ambient light. Okay, so first off, a lot of people will start working with flash, with portraiture, before they've actually mastered ambient light. And I think it really needs to come as a secondary skill to mastering that ambient light. We have to be acutely aware of what is the lighting in the situation before we decide to modify it. For instance, this image of this Balinese dancer was captured just using the ambient light coming from her phone. This is taken with an A7S II at 51,200 with an f1.8 aperture. So really we don't need to add light unless we want to change the character of the situation for whatever reason. Okay, so let's look at some images where I'm using the ambient light without any flash at all. Okay, you'll notice that a lot of my portraiture I get in very, very close. Now, this was the third image that I'd taken of this woman in Little India in Singapore. And the first one, she's seen me and the camera, and she's sort of hamming it up for the camera. But by the time I've got very, very close to her, she's relaxed, and this is the actual shot that I want. I never point the camera at a complete stranger without... as soon as they notice the camera, I will lower the camera and I will engage. I'll give them a smile if I don't share any language. I won't try and take their picture without their permission. I will do some candid shots, but as soon as they notice the camera is lowered. Okay, so this is probably just a few minutes after taking that other image. I'm in a temple round the corner now, and I'm just using the light coming in through that open doorway that you can see on the right. Both of these images were captured with an 85mm 1.8 lens. It's often referred to as a portrait lens. For this specific reason, we can actually get quite a tight head and shoulders crop. We're at the perfect distance for shooting this type of portraiture. We're so close to people that no one will walk between the subject and myself. They'll walk around the back of me. I'm not so far away that I actually lose that personal connection between the person that I'm photographing. Okay. So even this lighting, it's very soft light. There's probably a diffused light. The sun is obviously coming through clouds, and there may also be some tree cover. Now, what I've noticed on workshops that I run, some people aren't actually aware of the subtle use of light and shade. And if you just try something out for me now, if you just squint, you will actually exaggerate the contrast of light and shade. And so if you're trying to see what light and shade is working on the subject before you photograph them, just by squinting your eyesight slightly will actually increase that contrast. So you're much more aware of the lighting. Now, we also need to be aware of where shadows are falling. Often broken light, sunlight that's been broken by maybe overhanging tree branches can be problematic for photographers. But some photographers don't actually see this broken light. They're seeing the form, the subject, they're seeing maybe the background, but they're not seeing that broken light. For instance, I was taking this shot and a woman was quite confused as to what I was taking a picture of. She said, "What are you taking?" Apart from the fact that I actually like modern architecture, but there didn't seem to be a subject in this woman's eye as to what I would actually take a picture of. And I said, "I'm taking a picture of the shadow." And she looked and she stared, and it took her like 1 or 2 seconds to actually see the shadow being cast from the tree. So first, before we see the subject, we have to sort of see how the light is interacting with our subject. Okay, most of my portraiture is taken in this soft ambient light. Okay, so direct sunlight can be a problem, especially in the middle of the day as it's coming directly down from above. So I'll often work when the sun is very low, or try and exploit overcast lighting, or push people back under shade wherever possible. Okay, so this is all soft diffused lighting, and it's very flattering for subjects to be lit. It's actually very expensive to get this quality of light in a studio environment, because we have to invest in very, very large lighting modifiers just to replicate what skylight does with the absence of sunlight. Okay, so I'm working an event now, and typically what I'll do is I'll probably work at a focal length slightly longer than 85mm at an event, because I can't always have the undivided attention of one of my subjects. So sometimes I'll work with a 135 prime. If you don't have a prime, or you don't yet want to invest in those prime lenses, you could work with a 70-200. And I would pretty much be working wide open with a 70-200 telephoto zoom. Okay, so again, I took a candid shot of this guy before then moving in closer. Now you'll notice as I move in closer, I often crop into the top of the head. Now this is something that amateurs will often stand further back to get everything in, and a professional will often take 2 steps forward to create a more dramatic composition. Now, as well as me preferring this style of portraiture, I also learnt in my editorial career this is the shot that the picture editor wanted. Whatever the story or narrative was about, they were always looking for the hero portrait, and it was a tight crop. And I also stopped shooting so many vertical images and started shooting horizontal or landscape images, because a big win for a photographer is when the desktop publisher puts your image across the double page spread. And that's not going to happen if you're shooting in vertical format. Okay, so just to contradict that, I do turn the camera around occasionally. This was at Anzac Day last year. I shot it again this year with another different lens. I'll often go to these events with a single lens. This one was 100 STF, and this year I shot it with a 135 2.8 lens. Okay, so this is shot with an 85 1.4, and these, if you're nervous about shooting pictures of people who are not your friends, typically strangers, one of the ways you can get into it very easily to feel more comfortable with the process is to simply go to events where people expect to be photographed. Okay, so this is an anime festival at Jeff's Shed, held annually, and these people spend 4 hours in front of a mirror and would be severely disappointed if no one actually took their photograph. So working with these people, it's like working with free models, basically. Another idea, another suggestion is just to shoot a sporting event like a triathlon. People are quite happy for you to take their portraits before and after the event. Other examples would be a working museum like Sovereign Hill, where people are paid to dress up in historical dress, and then they're told to pose for the tourists. And so it's very easy to break down that fear of photographing strangers once you've done it 100 times. And it might take 100 portraits before you feel really comfortable with this process. In the last 5 or 10 years, I don't think I've ever had anyone make a rejection. So it's just the natural way of me going in without feeling nervous, going in, and I often don't ask if I can take their photograph. I'm so interested in who they are or what they're doing. The photograph opportunity is sort of like a follow-on from saying, oh, this is fabulous, what do you do? We need to get a picture of this. And I often put it that way, we need to get a picture of this, not can I take your picture? If the first thing that comes out of your mouth is, can I take your picture? You've got a 50-50 chance, I reckon, because there are two answers, yes and no. And if they don't know who you are, and you're looking very nervous, then I dare say the answer is more likely to be no. Okay, so these are amazing characters. Okay, so I often run a workshop in Port Melbourne, and if it's a completely sunny day, I invite the participants to find the shadows. And on Princess Pier, you'd say there's probably not that many opportunities for shadows, completely missing the fact that we can go underneath the pier. And when that happens is the daylight comes in like low stage light. And so we can get quite dramatic but soft light that shapes a three-dimensional form by just using that light that comes in from the side, not from above. This is up at Beechworth. This is a guy who works at the Beechworth courthouse, obviously where Ned Kelly was tried before coming down to Melbourne. And he looks a bit of a Ned Kelly character himself. And that's, again, just the light coming through. There's a doorway to the left of the image there, and maybe an open window. But see how that models that light? I've almost got a perfect, what I call Rembrandt lighting on the shaded side of the face. The Rembrandt lighting indicates there's a small triangle of light that lights the top of the cheek, but the shadow coming off the nose extends all of the way to the side of the head. That's often referred to as Rembrandt lighting. You'll find some very dramatic uses of that with quite a harsh light source, but it's also, once you've learnt to spot it, you'll ask a sitter just to angle their head ever so slightly towards the left or right. And I'll often use my hand, I'll hold my hand up, and so they associate my hand with their head, and I'll just show them how much or little that I actually want somebody to angle their head. Okay, so one of the lighting modifiers that I will use before resorting to flash is one of these 5-in-1s, and I know they're available here. I walk past the wall of them. These are very easy, they weigh nothing, and perhaps the one of the 5 that I use the most is not the reflector, but it's the diffuser, sometimes referred to as a scrim. It's allowing the light to fall through a semi-transparent material, and that will diffuse the light nicely. I've just got an extract from one of my many movies. I've got hundreds of movies to help educate photographers to show that in process. It only runs for 30 seconds. There are a couple of alternatives. If we do have to film in sunlight, we could either use a reflector or a scrim that diffuses the sunlight. You can pick these up at photography resellers for not too much money, and they can be very useful if we have to work in sunny conditions. We've got our assistant Kate here, who's just going to put the scrim into place, and we'll show you how we can soften that light. So you just need to raise it high, and you can see the effect of diffusing that sunlight to get a much more flattering lighting across the model. Okay, so very easily you can see it's still the light is still shaping the face. It's still directional light, but it's so much softer. It's like using a softbox or an umbrella when you're out on location. So without even using a flash, I'd say the only downside of that workflow is you really need somebody else to hold the scrim for you. Okay, so a little bit of word about lenses. I've already discussed these. Is if you're on an APS-C sensor, often referred to as a cropped sensor, then one of the cheapest portrait lenses you can get is just the humble 50mm 1.8 lens. It's usually one of the cheapest lenses the camera companies make. And if you can't afford to stay with your brand of camera, there will be plenty of people who make lenses at this focal length. 50mm becomes an ideal portrait lens on a crop sensor. For those people who have gone full frame, then I would certainly look at something like an 85 1.8. There are 1.4 versions of the 85. They tend to be double the weight, double the money, and often not necessarily that much sharper, if they're sharper at all, than the 1.8. Okay, and I know this to be the case with Sony. This is a Sony 85 1.8, and it's almost bang on as sharp as their 1.4 GM. And I came from Nikon many years ago, and I remember the 85 1.4 and 1.8 were equally as sharp. There might be a hair's breadth between them, but really nothing significant. Okay, so let's take a look at composition. Okay, so portrait mode is often referred to as vertical. One of the things that I'm showing you in these shots, all taken in portrait mode, is how little background we see behind a head and shoulders portrait. That can be advantageous, but if we're trying to place somebody in a location or exploit background blur, sometimes referred to as bokeh, then we've got limited opportunity to do that. So if you haven't done much of this type of portrait, what I would encourage you to do is shoot all of your portraits for the next 2 weeks, all in horizontal format. Because as you can see, the negative space around the portrait now is quite significant. And again, for a magazine editor, they have somewhere to put the text. Okay, because generally magazine editors don't want to put the text always off the image on a double page spread. They would like negative space to put the text on the image, and I learnt this through my editorial background. Okay, so obviously when we approach complete strangers, there is that little bit of nervousness. We want to get it over and done with because we almost like feel their pain. But once you've got permission or they're happy to be photographed, then I would slow down enough so you get the shot. And don't just take one, take half a dozen until you get the shot. So this is a typical thing where you ask 2 people for a photograph. They'll stand shoulder to shoulder, and you've got too much negative space between those 2 heads. Wedding photographers and social photographers are much better at arranging 2 or 3 or 4 people and reducing the negative space so they don't look like enemies, they look like friends. Okay, but after you've taken a shot like this, I would always go in for the hero shot. Okay, there's actually just a crop from the other one, and just to show you how much more dramatic it is if we can go in that little bit closer. You can crop your high-resolution images, but you actually don't get quite the same image, because the closer you go, the shallower the depth of field. And what that does is it creates a different atmosphere or mood altogether. Okay, so as you can see now, we're getting in very close, and this is hardly cropped at all. And if I ask you what that background is, you'll probably struggle to understand what that is. It's basically just the roots of the tree. It's on a perfectly sunny day, and I've just asked, this is my daughter Tegan, just to move back underneath the shade, because I want a much softer lighting. And I'll go closer and closer. And this one has been more popular than the previous one, just because people love that very close, very shallow depth of field look. Okay, so typically what I would do is if your focusing skills aren't perfect yet and you need a little bit more practice, what I would do is, if you're on a crop sensor, I would start around f2.8 for this tight portraiture. If you're on full frame, which has shallower depth of field than crop sensors, then I would start around f4. This image I took of Gilbert Namala on a Darwin Indigenous community was shot at f4, and this isn't being cropped. And you can see the background, which is a piece of tin, a tin shed. That has gone very soft, because I've asked Gilbert just to step 2 steps towards me away from the background, so the background goes soft. Okay, and again, you'll see what I've done is, even though I've gone close, the placement of the eyes is not absolutely centre, it's sort of off-centred. Some people refer to the rule of thirds, but I typically don't have a rule of thirds overlay over my image, but I just attempt not to centre everything I do. In fact, the vast majority of my images are off-centre, and the eyes in a close portrait like this will be above that centre line. Likewise, if you're doing these portraits, the position of the chin for me is also important. These are not hard and fast rules, I'd like to say. You'll see images of portraits that break these, but I try to keep the chin off the deck. Okay, I try and keep it away from that lower edge of the frame, because I don't want the sitter's head to look like it's resting on the bottom of the frame. So we just need a little bit of room for the face to breathe under and around that jawline. Okay, just to back forwards on that one is, you see the background there. I've actually gone closer, and the reason that I've positioned the subject a little bit closer to the background is I wanted those handprints, the painted handprints, to be clearly visible in this composition. Okay, I only took this last week up at the Spud Fest at Trentham. And I posted this shot, and somebody on one of my forums said he'd posted an image that used a similar sort of composition, and his camera club told him that it was a failed composition. So he felt reassured that mine was very similarly arranged. And they said, and I said, why did it fail? And he said, because the eyes weren't on the rule of thirds. And I actually didn't know how I'd frame this, because I sort of frame intuitively now. But I went back and I put an overlay on it. And you see there is a little bit of a crop. That isn't the rule of thirds in Lightroom, that is the golden ratio, which actually predates rule of thirds. And I actually find it a more comfortable overlay if I was going to use a formal compositional tool such as overlays. If you want to get to the overlays in your crop software in, say, Lightroom, you just press O for overlay, and you'll cycle through choices of overlays. Okay, so if I don't always do this, but I often remember to try and take some pictures leading up to my hero shot. So I've noticed this guy at the monkey forest in Bali, and I've decided I want his portrait, but this is where I've just seen him, thinking he's got an interesting face. I will now go closer, but this is where I originally encounter him, and that's the final shot. Okay, so let's just go back. That is the wall. Okay, that is going to be the background, but as I go closer, the wall becomes this creamy bokeh, which is ideal for that studio-esque but location portrait that I've captured. And again, just having him turn his head slightly, I get the light shaping his face so we can see the bone structure. Okay, so if you're working on location and you stop down a little bit more, the background becomes sharper, and the placement of that subject becomes more and more important, the more detail that we include. If you're working out on location, say at a beach or wherever the horizon line is visible, if you're the same height as your model, the horizon line will go through the neck. Okay, so which is not the best place to put horizon line most of the time. So typically you can move the horizon line by changing your physical height to the subject. So if you bend your knees, the horizon line will go lower with you, but the model stays the same height. So eventually what will happen is the horizon line will go down through the shoulders. You create more negative space in the top left-hand corner in this instance. So again, a magazine editor could put a title, some text, the product, whatever it is that they're using for that negative space. Okay, occasionally I am faced with the impossible background where there doesn't seem to be any sort of background that I can use, and then I would resort to just burning it darker in post-production. Notice something else I've done in post-production there is I'm not a fan of lime green t-shirts, and I fully suspect Frank doesn't own this lime green shirt anymore. So what I've done is I've just desaturated greens in post-production. Okay, so I basically limited the color palette. This would not be permissible in photojournalism, but in editorial it would. Okay, you have to decide whether it's a document of what actually happened, and photojournalism doesn't allow you to change the hue of a particular colour. You can drop it completely to black and white, but you can't basically change one colour into another. Camera settings. I tend to say to people, just think about your, I call them safe settings, shutter speed, aperture, where should the focus be, and the exposure. Okay, we'll often need to up or down the exposure slightly if we're shooting in a semi-auto setting, such as aperture priority. What I'd like to do is, because I don't ask people to freeze motionless, is I do raise the shutter speed. I don't shoot with something like a 50th of a second, even if they look like they're standing still, because I don't want a blink or a slight turn of the head to appear to defocus the image ever so slightly. Some people, tell me, the lens missed focus, and I'll say, no, I think you'll find that that's a slow shutter speed that is due to, not to a focus error. They actually have slightly different signatures, and when you get used to looking at the different signatures, you can see whether it's a focusing error or it's a subject blur. Okay, so aperture priority, I've talked about f4 for full frame. It's the starting point. I will go much wider, or 2.8 for APS-C. I always focus on the eyes. The eyes have it. If the eyes are sharp, it doesn't matter if the ears are soft or the front of the nose, tip of the nose is soft. If the eyes are sharp, then it's a sharp portrait. And exposure compensation, if you've got a model wearing very bright clothes, you might need to up the exposure. Very dark clothes, you might need to lower the exposure. Okay, so there it is, minimum shutter speed. I shot this on this year's Anzac Day. Still subject, but the horse is moving, so just making sure that shutter speed doesn't fall below 1/160th of a second should allow me to get all of the shots sharp. Okay, unreliable focus. Some people will resort to spot AF because someone told them it was the most reliable. It is the least reliable unless you have time to position it accurately. So if you put a single spot AF point on that white shirt, all cameras will hunt. They are looking for a vertical edge, and if it doesn't find one, it doesn't know where the subject is. So if you were working with a single spot, it would actually make more sense to put it on the tie or on his glasses, but not on the white shirt. I actually would tend to favour using larger focus areas and only reduce to smaller focus areas if the camera is struggling to find the subject. So if you're not setting on wide, might come down to zone, then come down to large area, then come down to small area last. I typically now work with a feature on the Sony cameras, and I believe they're there on the Fuji cameras as well, something called IAF. The algorithms for IAF have been getting better and better now, so that on the Mark III cameras and on the A9 Sony, they are freakishly good, like 99% good. So this woman has just glanced at me. She's not completely aware there's somebody in front of her at the moment. She's just turned up mid putting phone away in pocket. I've taken the shot, and immediately as one flowing motion, the camera is being lowered as I'm smiling. So she's never actually sure whether I've taken a picture or not, especially if I'm shooting in silent shutter mode. The camera doesn't physically make a noise. And so this will basically find the eye exceptionally quickly in a sort of a nanosecond. It will just lock on to the eye to make sure that if I am working at 1.8, 1.6, 1.4, it will always track the eye. Again, same thing. We saw this guy earlier where I was actually doing now more of a formal portrait with him. But this is the first split second where he noticed me. I take the shot, the camera gets lowered. I move in to have the conversation, even if it's only a hand gesture conversation. In the round 3 Sony cameras, the A7R3, the 7 III, the A9 cameras, it will now pick up an eye even with the face turned away from the camera. It only has to have a bit of one eye in order to realise that is the eye, and I should take that as my hero focus point. Okay. If you're working with maybe somebody that's turning their face 3/4, just remember 1.8, 1.4 on a full frame camera, there may not be enough depth of field for both eyes to be sharp. What we typically do is we get the eye that's nearest to the camera, often referred to as the leading eye, or we can stop down so both eyes are sharp. Okay, so if I'm working with 1.8 here, but because there's 2 people, even though I think the eyes are the same distance from the camera, I will still stop down a couple of stops just to ensure both the grandmother and the grandchild are sharp in this particular image. And if I think the depth of the subject, or there's one person standing behind another, sometimes I would just stop down 3 stops and then in post-production realise it wasn't enough. So typically if I'm working full frame, I'll stop down 4 stops from f1.8 in order to make sure that I have enough depth of field for the subject who is slightly trailing in the scene. Okay, and it's one of the reasons I still lose the occasional shot. I stopped down 3 stops for this one, but I'm so close with my 85mm that this female monkey here, although the whiskers are pin sharp, if you zoomed in onto this 42 megapixel file, you'll realise the eyes are ever so slightly soft, which is slightly disappointing. Okay, I don't try to aggressively stop down because this was in low light, it was raining, and I don't want the ISO to climb unnecessarily high. But I wished I'd closed down just an extra stop in order to get the depth of field I needed for that shot. And IAF doesn't work on monkeys. Okay, so open door. It's one of my go-to techniques. You'll find a lot of press photographers and photographers who often only get 2 or 3 minutes with their subject. will often have a go-to a technique. They'll often be invited to maybe an airport lounge or a hotel room. Not ideal for a photography sitting, but we learn to exploit what we have on location. And so this guy was turning wood inside this shed at Sovereign Hill, and I just asked the guy to quickly come to the open door. The open door gives a lovely dark background behind the subject. It also gives something for the sitter to interact with. They can lean on it, they can touch it, an excuse for the hand to come up from the side and up towards their face. Okay, so, and I use this a lot. There's a guy leaning on an open doorway. This time, again, the light coming in from the side, and we've got that dark interior on the right. This one, I'd just given a seminar to a college in Perth, and I was talking about the open door, and we finished 5 minutes early, so I said, let's do an IAF open door portrait. So I took this, I only took one shot, and of course the eye was pin sharp. You can see the ears are soft, because that's what happens when you shoot 1.8 at close range like this. This was at my niece's, she was having a makeup party just before she got married, and I asked the makeup artist who was making up all of the friends just to come to the open doorway of the suburban house. Most suburban houses have a veranda or porch or a covering, so even if it's on a sunny day, you still get that shade, so the ambient light is always being forced to come in from the side, not from above. So you never get dark wells in the eyes, you always get open lit eyes. Just exploiting, looking for natural occurrences of open doorways, always. Okay, occasionally the backgrounds are cluttered, busy, and you'd struggle to find any open doorway. I'm looking at an open doorway, and there's a transit van there. I could possibly use that. But I also, if I'm travelling with somebody who is prepared to be my assistant, I travel with a black piece of velvet-like fabric that I picked up from Spotlight. I'll just showing you a timestamp there. This is the first time I glanced this guy. It's 10:40:29. Okay? That's 10:41:07. 38 seconds have transpired. And this is my third shot of him, so there was another shot before this one. The black piece of fabric has gone behind the head. I've asked him to remove his sunglasses, and I've asked him to sit up a little bit straighter. We've actually took 10 seconds for actually get him to face relax, because I'd made a joking insult at him. He was basically saying, he'd seen me taking pictures of other people, and he said, why don't you take a picture of me? And I said, you're too ugly. And so, but what that meant is for the next 10 seconds, we had this like smirk, laugh thing going on, and it took another 10 seconds to relax there. But that's how quickly some photographers can work when put in a position, is how do you exploit the lighting, the background, and organise the sitter for that very natural portrait to occur. That was ended up being a full-page image in Australian Photography magazine, and I went back the next month and I gave him a magazine, and it rendered this guy speechless. I don't think he'd ever seen himself photographed in such a heroic sea captain sort of way before. Okay, introducing flash. Okay, I will introduce flash, but because I'm so good at using ambient light, often I can get what I want just with the situation that I have in front of me. Okay, first off, flash on camera is my least favourite idea. Okay, if I was flash on camera, I'd be looking for some way to bounce it. You know, I'd be looking up to see what the tonality of the ceiling or the walls beside me. I'd be wanting to know where is basically the big softbox that I can bounce that light off. Okay, so this is fill flash just directed straight at the bird. Now you can't actually see the presence of the flashlight in this one. It's also using a flash setting called high speed sync, because I'm using a very fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the blur. So I've exceeded the maximum sync speed of a curtain shutter, which is usually around 250th of a second. So you must have a flash that can work and talk with your camera in order to pull this off. You can now see the presence of the flash. The branch has created a very subtle shadow on its tail. Okay, the reason I'm using fill flash here is just to get a little bit more pop in the feathers because we're photographing in a dark forest. So I'm just getting, the ISO will be really elevated, 6,400 often, but I'm adding flash just to get a little bit more detail in the subject. We've also got a nice catch light in the eye as well coming from that flash. Okay, so my typical flash that I will be using uses radio transmission, so it's a way of communicating between the camera and the flash when the flash is off the camera. And this is done instead of by using infrared, which needs line of sight, I'm using radio signals. So the flash could actually go behind a tree or out of the building and it would still fire. So the current Sony flashes, there are now 2 of them, have the RM. Okay, they're a radio flash. The R is for the radio. Okay, so lighting modifiers. I typically don't like using lighting stands because they'll usually require a shot bag on a windy day, because if you attach an umbrella to that lighting stand, basically it's a very expensive error if there's a gust of wind and it takes the lighting stand with your flash to hit the concrete floor. So I will work that way if I have to, if there's no budget for an assistant, but typically what I will do is you'll see that there's an S bracket on the right side which has got like a pistol grip. I could actually hold a lighting modifier at arm's length from me slightly around to one side of the model, even if I didn't have an assistant and I'm not prepared to put that on a stand. Now, a couple of choices there. There's a softbox and there's one called a beauty dish. Okay, my preference is the beauty dish. Actually, it's a little bit flatter, a smaller, packs down a little bit smaller, so I can get it into a messenger bag, and I can hand hold it with that S bracket. Okay, so this was at a demo at RMIT University, and I wanted to put the same character in the same shot. I've got a little tutorial movie of how to do this. It's called a fixed position composite, and it's all lit with just a single flash off camera. What I typically do is I underexpose the ambient light by 2 stops. So the figure ground separation is exaggerated, not just because of focus, but also because of lighting difference. It is possible to have flash correctly exposed and the ambient light underexposed. And the flash that I'm using in the foreground won't light up the background, it's too far away. Okay, so it is possible to do this in TTL. Okay, most cameras will show you the ambient exposure and the flash exposure as 2 separate scales. So you can do this quite quickly if you look on your camera menus and you find this. It's on all Sony camera manuals. Okay, and there you can see my lighting technique. It's very cheap. Okay, especially if you've got somebody to hold the flash and the lighting modifier. I've set the flash to maximum spread. Okay, wide angle, so it will completely fill that diffuser. Don't put the flash too close to the diffuser because you'll get more of a spot look. Just pull it so it's arm's length, and then it will fill that diffuser and you'll get a nice soft light, which led to that final composite, which was for a Photoshop tutorial I was doing. Okay, keeping it simple, even on a sunny day, look at the shadows. Okay. I might, if I'm being very adventurous, and especially if I'm being asked to make a tutorial for Sony, use what's called a 3-point lighting. 1 is the ambient light, 2 is the hero light, which is the flash on the umbrella with the number 1 on it, and 3 is the rim light in red on the left there, which is often creates this little rim of light to give more 3-dimensional quality. So first thing that I do is find how to underexpose the ambient light by 2 stops. So this is underexposed, 2 stops. Then I switch the flash on. And now I'm just raising the flash exposure by +1/3. Because she's wearing white, the TTL flash will underexpose slightly, so I'm just raising the flash exposure. Very quick to set up once you've done it half a dozen times. It's a real no-brainer. And you can see the rim light on the left side of the image on her hair. That's just giving that little kick on the side. Okay, we're coming to a close, Carly. So just showing you that lighting. On the top of the camera is what's called a commander or a trigger. That's basically telling the flash to fire. Okay, and that's giving you that figure ground separation there. Fortunately, I had somebody making the movie, so I got a behind the scenes shot of exactly that sort of shot that I'm shooting there. Okay, actually I've left the little kick light in there on purpose just to create a little bit of flare. Flare was always a bad thing. It's got a little bit trendy, hipster, should I say. And so leaving a little bit of a flash in, creating that little bit of flare is just giving that little bit of a character. And you can see the rim light going all the way down the arm there. Hollywood loves it. Okay, it's just that little bit of rim. And you can also put a coloured gel on that rim light if you wanted a coloured light. Okay, occasionally I'll do manual, okay, which is to set each of those three elements separately, the rim light, the main light, and the backlight. This is more appropriate if the lights and the model are not moving. I would always encourage you to use TTL if the model is going to be changing their position, how close or far away they are from the lighting. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly chimping to see whether the flash exposures are appropriate. And these triggers will allow you to work with more than just 3 flashes. Most of the triggers now will work with 5 separate flashes, but I tend to never work that complicated. Okay, there's an example of the Rembrandt lighting I was talking about, is where you choose to position your main light ideally should be that. If you are going to create softer fill over it, that's generally the position. Generally what you don't want is a big triangle shadow coming off the nose. Okay, that's halfway towards Rembrandt but didn't get far enough. Okay, you also typically don't want to light the underside of the nose, so the light that you use tends to be a little bit higher than eye level, okay, and moving around to one side in order to create that effect. Okay, so that shot that I talked about earlier, these are more subtle and they're often difficult to spot unless you're squinting or you're just used to seeing the light falling on a face. That is typically what I'm asking a sitter to try and do while I'm often squinting, just to make sure that I've got the correct angle for that natural or flashlight. Okay, so we've come to the end of my talk. We are going to have a couple of questions. And just a reminder, I am going down to the Sony stand. We'll do 2 questions here, is that right?
Yeah, so sorry, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 1 or 2 questions. I'm going to come to you with the microphone so that we can all hear the question. So just firstly, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So,
Well,
round of
Kylie's...
applause.
Yeah, just while you're thinking of your question and before Kylie walks out with the microphone, if 1 hour of listening to me talk is enough, then you probably had your fill. If the idea of me talking to you for a week sounds like a good idea, then I'm going to Fraser Island in August with Australian Photography Magazine and World Photo Adventures. I'll also be on King Island in November. Hopefully you know where King Island is. Testing people's Australian geography. If that's all too close to home, I'm doing 2 tours to North America. I'm doing Yosemite and Death Valley. Death Valley is one of the freakiest places on the planet. If you thought the idea of going to Mars was interesting, just use Google Maps to look at Death Valley. And I'll also be going to the deserts and canyons of USA. This is all around September next year. Okay, so thank you for your time.
Give you, Mark. All right, so I've just been informed we've got time for 1 question. So I need 1 lucky person. Here we go. I'm just going to give you the microphone.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the earlier photography, say Cartier-Bresson, and it was always very soft. And in fact, some of the images by Dorothea Lange, obviously shot on film, lots of crap in the image, and actually makes a nice part of the narrative.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, especially with things like Photoshop, how sharp is too sharp?
Look, I do work. When I started my career, I worked with second-hand lenses. Now I'm working with some of the sharpest lenses ever made. You know, the GM lenses, the Zeiss design lenses, and sometimes what you do want to be able to do is because, like, I need to know how people are seeing my images on social media. And I typically benchmark that as a 4K image. I've got a 4K monitor. Okay, I don't think there's a lot of point in owning a 42 megapixel camera and reviewing it on a laptop with less than 2 megapixels. So I'll review the image at 4K and I'll adjust the sharpness so it looks correct to me on that 4K monitor. How other people will view it is really a mixed bag, because monitors can be, people can adjust sharpness on TVs and monitors, and so you're never in complete control until you print. And so, and I would encourage more of you to print, and I know Michael's take great pride in printing. And so if you've never printed very large prints, I would encourage you all to have a go at that, because that's where you can have absolute control about how your images are viewed, and that's why most photographic artists will still exhibit. Yes, on post-production, sometimes I don't add sharpening. I'll just take the default.
Okay, wonderful.